to start?
Sure.
Yeah. I appreciate you all coming, and we've watched from Mark Lakeman, and it's great to see so many people like actually come to this. This is really inspiring, and it's inspiring for you to come out here. And we have a bowl set aside for donations for Mark. You guys, any you can donate. If you can't, no worries. But if you can, there's it in the back. So I just want to say that, and thank you for coming.
Thanks.
We're honored to have you.
I just want to say before we get started, I know that people can see better when they're kind of on center with this, but if you can't see the images from where you're sitting, I encourage you to come more to the center, because some of these images are quite extraordinary and surprising. Well, Stephen and I have been talking about having this slideshow for several months, and there's a lot of back and forth and other people getting involved, and it ended up being part of a speaking and kind of action tour that included Los Angeles and Santa Monica and Pasadena, and then here, and then in San Luis Obispo as well. And I used to come down. I've never been to Bakersfield before, but I used to come down to Southern California all the way as far as San Diego to work with different communities that were looking for some support in figuring out how to organize, especially to kind of create in public spaces, to create in streets. And for a lot of communities, like their starting point for wanting to do that doesn't necessarily begin with a perspective on how the space between our homes used to bring us together before the advent of the car, and what it meant to communities to have a place right outside your home where children could play safely, where festivals could happen, where literally lots of different kind of annual events and festivals, holidays would be celebrated as a community event out in the streets. And so people are really interested in what we've managed to accomplish in Portland. And I'll just say something right off the bat that is insanely wonderful. And that is that in Portland, we've made it so that any community anywhere can transform as many public, like street intersections, into community spaces or public squares as they want to in their neighborhood for free and immediately. So why would that even be a big deal? Well, it turns out, like, just to have some perspective, Americans actually have to leave the United States to visit a place where you might say villages are made by villagers. The fact is that Bakersfield, like Portland or Chicago or pretty much everywhere in the United States that isn't based on indigenous, place-based people, has been laid out for profit. And so, as an architect and a planner, I can tell you a lot about how that process works. Usually when it comes to a neighborhood, it starts off with somebody having somehow gotten a hold of a lot of someone else's land, and then they intend to build a lot of stuff from which they'll make a profit. And I'm talking about a development company, and of course the bankers are very interested, because everyone that buys a house ends up paying 2.5 times or more the actual sticker price of the house. And all that surplus goes to the bank to be distributed to the people that the bank feeds. So it's a little bit of a trick that Americans really haven't kind of traced through in their thinking, that like working class people that work 30 years just to pay for a house are constantly enriching a class of people that works against the interests of the working people by constantly delivering them surplus income. Yeah, come on in. So, and I just want to say, as I'm going along, if anybody feels like they want to speak up and offer an extra thought or challenge an idea or even ask a question, please feel free as we're going along. I should also say, as we enter into looking at these pictures of people just joyously recreating the streets, I want to tell you that for me as a designer, I was trained to be a corporate designer. Came out of architecture school full of the elitism and really all the patriarchy that could be stuffed into me. self-important, competitive, yeah, and probably with all of these patterns of supremacy, undoubtedly. And I was really lucky early in my career to be present during this meeting. We were designing the Bank of America in Portland, Oregon, and it was right on the edge of the major waterway going through Portland, which is the Willamette River. And I already knew that there was like decades of toxicity dumped on the site by the client before they wanted to build their building. And I was present in this meeting where officials from the government were talking about all the toxicity on the site, and they were forcing us to dig it out of the site before we built the building. And finally they just said, let's just cap it. And I watched a deal between the government officials and the vice president of the biggest construction company in the state of Oregon, Hoffman Construction, make a deal. And the officials walked out, and I couldn't believe what I had just seen. It was literally a form of a payoff that allowed the construction of the building to proceed while we just left all the toxicity in the ground. And as that happened, I remember looking at my hands and just thinking, so this guy doesn't even know my name. The vice president of this company was just laughing about how this was something they did routinely. And I just realized this is happening everywhere. This isn't just today's meeting. This is happening all over because they can just laugh about it and joke about it like this after the officials left. So I looked at my hands and I was like, okay, so I've got white skin, and I'm wearing a tie, and I look the part so that this person can just say this stuff that is illegal by every measure, and he just thinks I'm in on it. And I know a lot of other people in the room are uncomfortable, but it was just part of a culture of, as this vice president said, we don't want to slow down the timeline. It'll cost us money to have to continue to dig, so we're just going to continue doing this. And I was so upset. I went to my desk, and I couldn't even think until finally I realized I was quitting. And I encourage you to do this when you quit. There's this thing you can do on your last day that you can't do any other day, because if you do it, it's your last. So I just got up and I had 6 bosses, and I went to each of their desks and I was like, can I see you in the conference room right now? And like everyone goes like, oh yeah, sure, I'll, because that tone of voice always gets you to like think you're needing to be submissive or something. So they all came into the conference room, and I took like 2 or 3 hours to quit. And it wasn't like I made them wait for the punchline. I quit immediately, and then I said why. Like, what happened today, that you all saw was a betrayal of all the reasons that we ever went to school. I know for sure. Like, I don't know, I'm just wired this way. Like, I don't want to be like, you bastards. You all have given up on your dreams. Like, if I had been in a little bit of a different circumstance, I would also be in their position. And the truth is, they're also sitting there trying to make sure there's enough work for everyone to do, to feed their family, keep a roof over their head. So it's very possible to also be empathetic with everyone in this crazy complex paradox. So I quit for like a long time, and I kept drawing pictures of all these things that we'd been working on and all the ways that we could have done better. We could have made more natural light available to people. There was this one building that looked like a giant effigy of Mickey Mouse, and we never needed to do that. So like there's so many different ways we could have improved the human space for people, and certainly made things more ecological. And then I just was like, okay, I'm gone. But the way that I did it left them like feeling respected. Like I was trying to affirm that they still had it inside of them, to still remember their dreams and still act on behalf of the idea of designing a better world. So the reason I'm telling you this is that was my point of departure, and I really encourage you to make the most of it when you also have these points of departure, to speak directly with compassion, even if you're angry, because those are powerful moments. And I'm telling you this because we all go through this, but also years later when I came back after much travel, I had a building made of all recycled and natural materials. It was a big thing. still my favorite big thing that I worked on. Very much a community process, community design process, but it's all made of natural and recycled materials. And all these architects that I used to work with came to see the building, and they were like, I want you to know, like, the way that you left us, we started, like, they were teasing me about recycling, and they'd find like paper under my desk in a box, and they're like, ah, you're recycling. So I came back, and they're like, did this building, and they were there, and they're like, we started to recycle immediately. And we started to create standards, like more ethical standards and more ecological objectives for the work that we've been doing since then. So yeah, so there's a different way to part, which still maintains a connection. So I got the hell out of there though and traveled, and I didn't know how long I was going to go, but I just got a ticket to get out of the USA, because I was like, I don't even want to do this stuff. Like, the culture seems to be rotten, it seems to be confused, and I knew from the very beginning, before I started to travel, I was like, I want to see what human beings are like, because I'm pretty sure I don't know in this culture what we are capable of, what is like the best in us. I keep seeing the confusion, you know, and I didn't realize then that we live in the freaking Roman colonial grid, you know. I didn't realize that American neighborhoods have the fewest community gathering places of all the nations in the world, because we live in developments and not villages. You know, we're in it right now. Oh, so I had to go like 7 years, and I got more and more interested in place-based communities, and I went to lots of different circumstances. One of the most affecting experiences was in Egypt during Ramadan, where this great cannon goes off over Cairo, and this great cheer comes up. You know, when I was sitting there, I'd been taught to be freaked out by people with, you know, from the Islamic culture. And so I was like walking around in a place where I was trying to acclimate to stuff I was taught to be uncomfortable about. Meanwhile, people are beckoning me to sit with them in the street and just share, like, I don't know, maybe their last bowl of beans, but they're like, here, brother, sit with us. It's like, whoa, God, coming from America where we just never do that. You know, that's my cow, stay away, you know. So, yeah, but I finally ended up in this rainforest. I was like, now I really want to see what people are like who have never been conquered, who like have managed to evade colonialism. What is it like when you visit people who speak their own language, and they have their own mythology, and they have their own settlement patterns? What does it look like? Especially from a design standpoint, how do private places relate to public spaces? How does that work? Because when you see that story, you learn a lot about the people. Like when people come to America and they're like, boy, everything's long and flat and straight, and there's no places to gather, and the people don't talk to each other. Boy, Americans sure are weird. Like, why would they ever choose to live that way? The thing is, we didn't. We didn't. So as I was traveling, got a lot of advice. I was listening to people talk about Americans, and the more I heard, the more I was curious. Like, God, Americans, all they do is talk about money. They talk about the cost of things. Like, what did that cost? Their jokes are horrible. They're like the worst listeners. And to hear an Irishman talk that way about you is really, really hard. So, yeah, I kept listening to people's take on Americans. And then finally in this village, I had gathered so many different perspectives, and I didn't realize it, but I was getting ready to come home and do something, but I still didn't know what to do. And so what I'm going to show you today is, I've given a lot to it, but it's a confluence of so many different people's stories and inspiration. So I'm really excited because it's a cumulative story, and that's the story I think Americans are just aching for, how to be part of a greater whole. But in this Lakeman village in Chiapas, in this Mayan village, I got the most beautiful gift of empathy. So this person was saying, like, I was basically crying. I was apologizing for westward expansion. I was like, I'm so sorry for what Europeans have done to you. And okay, I need to tell you, I don't agree with what he said, because I need to be accountable. Otherwise, you just don't grow. You don't evolve if you don't face the truth and reality. But he said, and he was holding my face in his hands, and I was crying, and he was like, you guys cannot, meaning everybody, cannot take this upon yourselves. And I was like, what? What do you mean? And he was like, the only reason that you guys did this to us was because it was done to your own people so long ago, you don't even know who you are or your own story. So he's like, when you get home, and this is really, the reason I'm repeating this is because we can all do this, and this is everyone's story. And it turned out the reason that he was even saying this was because he did say to us in this village, you know, surely we are going to be finally wiped out, but we're standing here waiting to help anybody who comes here to leave with some way, some perspective that will help them make a difference too. So that's a lovely thing to remember. He said, you know, everyone's been subsumed and made to forget. So when you get home, go stand in the middle of a street intersection and notice that all of the lines are flat and straight. And then walk a few blocks and notice that it's the same. And then go to another town and notice that it's the same there. And then realize that you're in a giant, violently imposed infrastructure that, you know, regiments, stratifies, and controls the people that live there. And also, if you really want to know who you are, try to understand when your ancestors first came into contact with those lines. And that would be the last time, you know, you had your own place-based identity. So I was listening to all of that. My ears were just like, you know, 10 times bigger. And he also said, you're not going to understand what I'm really telling you because you've been taught to be so afraid of each other. You're so afraid you don't taste and touch, you don't feel and see the world you're in. You're divided internally and you're made to be afraid. You've even been taught that the source of your being is separate from the world. And so you all just replicate separation and division from each other. And so I was just listening, and he's like, it all comes down to like understanding, like all these issues we've been talking about, because I kept talking about issues. And he said, you don't seem to understand, they all come down to one thing. And I was just like, what is that? What is that? I've been wondering since I was 10, what is that? And it's difficult to exactly say, but it's this impulse, this false story of separation. And yeah, and it has many layers. So he said, when you get home, look at those lines and then see how you feel. So that's a story we can all relate to. I'm going to show you a little metaphor of exactly what I'm talking about. Because it's not enough to just talk about the problem. As this person said, this is the coolest thing ever. He's like, see all these issues and problems you got? These are all these misdesigned opportunities. And the main problem is you've allowed other people to design your world, to design your patterns. Look at this side. And he goes, phew, this luminous, floating, rotating garden that we're on, and all the ways that we could be instead. He's like, okay, he literally did this. He's like, feel this, feel that. And then he just went, ah, and I'm not going to repeat it for you because it's too shocking. And you'll think I'm crazy. But he was like, go like this, ah, and he just like let it all out. And we'd been talking about what it was like for them to be invaded by the Spanish. So he had a lot to be to lay out. And he's like, and then create. Engage it creatively. Reclaim, on behalf of your ancestors, reclaim your birthright to, basically be a placemaker. So here we have this metaphor. I call it the revolt of the pawns. You know how this works. This game is basically, it's called the game of the kings. Everybody's sort of divided by their superficial differences, but notice that there's a darker one over here and a lighter one over here because they've traded sides. We're looking at the 60s here, where people started to agitate and they went between communities. They started to cross-pollinate. So these agitator pawns, they're like community organizers or permaculturists. And they're like, you guys, do you hear yourselves? You're always talking about getting out of the box, thinking outside of the box. You fools, don't you see we're in boxes? And the other pawns are like, but this is our job. This is what we do. We can't, question anything. We can't change our behaviors. So fortunately, they managed to get into small groups with facilitators. When they're sitting there crying and hugging, and they're talking about their abusive childhoods and everything else that's been going on, and everybody's like, oh my God, you've been going through that? I thought it was just me. So then they go to the back row to confront their oppressors, the tall oppressive ones with funny hats behind them, and they're like, hey, you guys are always taking more than your share. You always, like, we're always doing all the work. What's up with that? And these guys are like, who, what? Us? What are you talking about? And the pawns get pissed, kick them off the board. Okay, so that's typical revolution. And when we play it that way, historically speaking, we end up repeating the same patterns. So instead of that, since the 60s and 70s, the great cultural revolution of this place, it's been looking a lot more like this, where people have lots of energy, so they initiate ideas. Other people have resources and they want to help. Other people, can't possibly get involved, so somehow people try to engage with them. And there's so many different things to be transcended in all of this, so it's not so simple. But this is a diagram for what we're talking about today. But the coolest thing about acting up in your community, like this chessboard acts up, all the other chessboards go, whoa, did you hear what's happening on that chessboard? And the kings and queens are all nervous because they're like, oh no, the pawns are figuring out how the game works. And the pawns are like, yes, at last the time has come. And then they rock their freaking neighborhood. Like, hell yes. They got this perennial food forest garden going around the perimeter. They're having some kind of harvest. They finally got a little dinner table so they can sit down. And there must be a video player and a rocket stove. I don't know. They've got Asian pears and a squash and some flowers, so they're having a harvest festival. And they got a couple little hot tubs down here. I know this might seem silly, but this is exactly what we're saying. Reclaim our identity as place-based people. Be powerful where we are most powerful, which is right where we stand. Like, you can see it right here in this place, but what if it goes into the streets, across the streets, goes down the streets in all directions? You know what I told you about intersections being available for public squares? Literally as many as people want to take for free, and then it became the roadways that connect the intersection. And then it became the Department of Transportation being so radically transformed that they keep making it easier and easier and easier for everyone. And they're like, hey, guess what we did this time? Now you can just go out and put out benches and kiosks and even composting systems in the street for free. Don't even tell us you've done it. It's automatically permitted and insured. That's crazy talk, but that's what's real. And all the stuff you've seen in Portland, Oregon, like, oh no, the conflicts in the streets, that's real. But the real story of Portland is what I'm showing you right now, which is happening right now. Okay, so this really is a street intersection filled with people, with two people that met because of the intersection, getting married, and the people officiating the marriage are two of their friends, a woman and a man, who both live right there. The street is filled with people. Like, is this traffic calming? Like, is this making the street safer? Is this like becoming the seeds of a village that will localize its patterns and reduce its carbon footprint because people start to work with each other locally instead of having to leave all the time? We have uncovered so many issues through in this engagement. Here's a huge one all across the country. Everybody gets up in the morning and leaves where they live to go work for someone else elsewhere to make the currency to pay for where they barely get to be, which is where they live. The home zone and the work zone has been divided and disintegrated. And that's like the best way to break down a village, even the possibility of a village, so that people no longer have full spectrum relationships with each other. And how can you possibly build relationships of trust when living and working are separated? So somehow the street can even become a sacred place. Like, I love aspiring to make it a safer place for pedestrians and bicyclists, but in an ancient sense, that location right there was where people used to bring their babies to bless them. Okay, I don't know if you can see this very well. This is just a promotional poster for our big barn raising project. It's about to happen in a couple weeks, and it's in its 23rd year. So we're trying to bring back the phenomena of the barn raising, which, would be like identified with a different word and a different emphasis in every culture, but the idea that people do things together to uplift the common, the community. And then they dance and they sing, and there's all this skill sharing that happens. And because people have so much warmth with each other, there's a lot of kissing that happens, babies that happen, and all this deep cultural interweaving of people's rootedness with each other that just turns the wheel of time for the community. So when we first got going, we were like, wow, there's nowhere to gather in our neighborhood. We live in the grid. Therefore, there's no possibility for a stewardship culture. No wonder we don't speak to each other and we feel afraid of each other and alienated. And a lot of us were like, well, that means we're not growing to our full individual potential. And for me, I was like always remembering, you can't taste your food, you can't see, you're full of fear. So I was wanting to unmake that the whole time. So then at another point, you realize, oh, community ritual is missing, the barn raising's missing. And then here's one of the most insane ones. A village has a social architecture which is so powerful and integrated, they don't need to leave and make money to pay for other people that replace them in their lives. Like, we used to be the fire department, we used to be the government, we used to be the police, and at the same time, when you live there and you're with your children, and you're the like inherent natural mentor of your children, so much less even goes wrong. So here's this insanity. By leaving and submitting to these crazy patterns, all the conditions for things to go awful emerge. And then by having to pay other people to put out the fire or to put out the fire in your child, and replace us in all these functions we used to provide for ourselves, it's thousands of % inefficient. And it's so utterly disempowering, it brings us to this place where we can't even relate to each other. Okay, so here's what we started to do about it. So coming back from all these villages, personally, this was a ball I got rolling. I had been to all these places where people had gathering places in their villages. So I knew that the great meeting house was missing. Of course, the public square was missing. And there's tons of other things. But the idea was to start with one thing. And I chose for myself the great meeting houses, the great circular meeting houses of the Celtic people. And at the same time, there were people also in our neighborhood who had traditions of circular meeting houses. But we took it to a deeper level. We wanted to create a regenerative culture. And what better kind of cue to give people than to create something that helps them feel like they're literally coming back inside of their mother when they go into that architecture. There was a lot going on for me when I was working on this. Like I was told in architecture school, the great modernist patriarchs said that nature and humanity are separate, and so the architecture of the United States especially has to enforce that distinction. So I was like, oh my God, that's like exactly wrong. So dumbass. So instead, I was like, this means if you design something that helps people connect to nature, you can make it out of trash and it will work. So this thing was made, you can see this is this giant womb space. If you got closer, you could see it's made out of 10 little tea rooms that all resonate with a different aspect of the human self, like a room of love. You'd go in there and it would be filled with all these pillows and poems and pictures of people embracing each other. The room of sisterhood, the room of brotherhood, the grandmother's porch, the room of humility, the best friends stage. So people would come into this gorgeous portal right here in the upper left, very beautiful, come through a kind of a birth canal into this space. And people would just be like, oh, this feels great. And a few people actually realized what the idea was. But for most people, it just helped them feel like a baby again. And that was really the idea. Can you create a space where people kind of re-enter a feeling from before they knew fear and prejudice, where it's just so much easier and safe? So that was the idea, a test. Would this work? So about 5 weeks into the project, all these neighbors were coming. Like the first week, there was 25. And there was no publicity, there was no posters, and it cost nothing. The whole thing was a potluck economy of sharing, which is something I had seen as I was traveling. Like, people are really more liberated when there's no condition or cost on sharing. So we were modeling that. And people were like, oh my God, can I bring like my grandmother's recipe for rhubarb pie? can I make a blackberry pie and bring it next time? So the next week there was 75, then 150, then 250, and then it was just like boom. More people than could even go inside. And at that point, then I should show you more pictures. I'll just tell you, the whole thing was surrounded by doors and windows that were all openable. So as soon as it was too full to enter, the entire perimeter dissolved.
Wow.
The entire perimeter of doors and windows that all just came out of dumpsters dissolved, and suddenly people were able to flow in and out. And they were on the yard all around the thing, and then they were all around the yards of the adjacent intersection. So people were bringing desserts and drinks and just occupying yards at a certain point. So along comes the city building inspector, and she walked up to this, and I had seen her at some protests, and I knew that she was part of this. I'm involved in a lot of different communities. I knew that she was part of this kind of like radical, like temple, sacred temple, the women's temple. And so she walked up to this, and she's just like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And she couldn't write a ticket. It was just like she knew what it was. It was a temple, basically, to the goddess, if you will. But nobody was saying that, but she sure saw it. So she couldn't even write a ticket. But eventually we were given a ticket and told, this is a problem, it has to go away. And then because all these people had been coming, including architects and engineers and politicians, like way beyond the neighborhood. And so all these people pushed back, and suddenly the city government had to step back and give us a temporary permit, which was enough time for it to have its effect. So when they said, for us to give you this permit, you have to give us some drawings, you have to we have to be able to stamp paper. So, okay, so we measured the thing and created these drawings, and it was a manifesto of all these things. It was a totally transparent, honest manifesto about colonialism and the ways that centralized hierarchy and bureaucracy defeat our ability to build community. So the reality of it was like this. It was made, as I said, out of stuff from the waste stream. And as you approached it through the yard, there was this crushed circuit box with this broken door that was open, and inside of it was this effigy of an African goddess with candles around her, and she was just laughing, as you can see here, just saying, like, to put words in her mouth, something like, ha ha ha, it's still me inside of all of this confusion. So people walked past her down the path to the tea house, and you can see it was woven into this living garden. There was literally trees coming up through the floor and branches coming down through the ceiling. And it was made out of also a lot of branches and tree parts from a storm that had blown down trees. But we had cherry trees and pear trees inside, and flowering vines and rhododendrons. And it was called the tea house, but it really meant hammer time. The tea was a hammer, and then the house was spelled H-O-W-S, meaning like how to act. Only, once you came in here, there wasn't an agenda, there wasn't a meeting. The idea, and this was absolutely coached by the Lakeman village I was in, was to spatially model the world that you want to live in. Instead of fighting against, directly create. That was the point. So you walked underneath this illuminated hammer in order to go through the door. And you also walked by the menu board of all the things that had shown up so far to have for dessert. So yeah, it was a radical act to create a gathering place, but it was also so fun that you almost couldn't understand that it was radical. So people could come in here and just have the best time ever and then want to create it back in the neighborhood where they live. So this is what it looked like during the day. You're walking through the birth canal there, and these tea rooms are on both sides of you. There's the room of love. All these people would just be snuggled in there. And there's this kind of temple in the middle with this roof that looks like the great mountain to the east of Portland called Mount Hood, and the sun always rises over the sacred mountain. So this was a little temple with a kind of fractured butterfly in the floor. And as you can see, it was very childlike. It was almost like being inside of a basket. And the point was to kind of make the boxes around it kind of go away so that you would feel like you were inside of something endless and infused with life. That's looking at the best friends stage where it was a bit elevated and you could do a performance and there were all these costumes. People were always bringing musical instruments. This is the grandmother's porch with all these pictures of family and a formal place to sit. This is inside the room of freedom of expression, all these musical instruments that people would play together. This is inside of the kitchen, which was kind of like being in a space capsule with like hundreds of cups around you and camp stoves and stuff because you're making some chai or some kind of drink. This is inside of the women's fort. It was this place of concentric seating so people could come in and kind of more easily identify with each other because they're sitting in a very intimate way. And this is what it looked like as it started to, the lights started to twinkle with about 100 candles lighting the space. It was really meant to feel like you're inside of a living fabric or inside of a forest. And looking at it from a rooftop across the way, you can see that it just kind of dissolved into the garden around it. So it was really very powerfully trying to say nature and humanity are integral. And that's why it went through the roof. Like the power of blurring boundaries and allowing things to grow over in a place where people feel like they can identify with each other had a restorative effect that has not stopped. Okay, so many people were coming together. And there's a really sad part of the story, which is that these two little girls who were coming to the tea house were suddenly run over by a car trying to get to the closest park, which was like 8 blocks away. And because of this tea house, suddenly people were talking, like they knew more people around them, and they were upset because they identified with these little girls that they now knew. The capacity and the connectedness of the people in the neighborhood had become massive. And so people were like, why the hell isn't there somewhere for children to play without having to cross a busy street? And in our part of the neighborhood, there wasn't even one bench to sit on without crossing a busy street. And we had almost no traffic markings to be able to get to that park. So people were really upset. At the same time, the last night of the tea house before the city was trying to make us take it down, we took all the energy from the tea house and we occupied the intersection. And all these people were dancing for hours in the intersection, and the police showed up. And somebody had called them from blocks away, like, oh, there's this crazy anarchistic uprising happening down the street. So they showed up, and Ed, the giant, scary-looking policeman who loved these little girls, every Monday night he would come to the tea house, and these little girls would be waiting for him with dessert and a drink, and he would come into the tea house. See, the thing about the police is, I advise you not to wait till the last minute where you're on the line bonking heads. The chocolate cakes, preemptive chocolate cakes strategy, seriously, is a powerful idea to like build community with people before you're in a stressful situation. So Ed, when he showed up and we were occupying the streets and stopping traffic, he was like, you know what? I am paid to stop stuff which is bad, but not stuff which is good. And when the Department of Transportation gives you a problem, call the police. I don't know how you feel about hearing that, but it was just like, what? Okay. So, yeah, that led to people taking the energy of the tea house out to the intersection, beginning with this little chalk dispenser. We called it the 24-hour self-service chalk station. And here you can see it immediately led to this little insurrection here on the corner. But that was about bringing people to their edge to realize that great public spaces depend upon people coming to that edge and giving the energy to the public space. So that was the first move. And this is what we did next. We totally collaborated to paint the street illegally. And we called the Department of Transportation. We said, you know, we've realized that the city has 6,000 intersections. And when we've looked at villages around the world, like intersections get to be gathering places. And I knew from my architectural education this one great truth of human habitat, which is this: where pathways converge, our lives are supposed to come together. And that's where the village happens. And it's always us going to water where there's resources, or going to water where there's some tradition or something. There's some reason we go there with water too that makes this kind of thing happen. So we're like, listen, like there's no community gathering places in any neighborhood. And they're like, look, we're just engineers. Don't talk to us about this. And we're like, no, we're going to talk to you about it because you're in charge of almost all the public space of the city. And then they said, listen, that's public space, so nobody can use it. And we were like, wow, that's amazing. Did you hear that? That's so great that you said that. And they're like, oh, you're so frustrating. Go back to your community. Well, and we're like, well, that's where we are right now. You're saying, let's just get this straight. You never even come here, but you get to decide what happens, and we who live here and pay for a frickin' box for 30 years have no power? And they're like, duh. And we're like, okay, duh. And so we did it anyway. So you can see, here's all these criminals, or rather villagers, out in the streets. And if you could see closely, you'd see that we have installed a place for neighborhood history, a 24-hour solar-powered self-service tea station, a bench big enough for your family to just sit there and look at the stars, a community stage, all these places for information and expression, a kids' playhouse, an art museum, and a little library. Because we were like, the greatest public spaces in the world have all these little functions. Let's treat our own place like a garden with little starts and seeds. We'll just grow all these things. We don't need $1 million endowment. We'll just start with scraps of stuff and just get the function going, because we're permaculturists. And that's what it looked like. This little seating pavilion where Pedro and Adriana got together and made this other little neighbor to help out. This yard becomes a garden. Here's the kids' playhouse, and there's the tea station. We were challenging everything. Like, this is, I would say to you, geographically based injustice in terms of like power, society, and ecology begins with how this question is answered. Like, do you have agency or do you not? Do you have the power where you live or do you not? And when you put, this is, by the way, on this intersection was the first little free library in the world. But you should know, every little free library is supposed to come with a radicalized street, a radicalized intersection. So in 1996 was when this was built, and it was the idea of these two little kids who had lost their parents, and a carpenter got together with them and gathered some stuff from some houses being torn down and built this library in a couple of hours, taught them how to hammer a nail, because nobody was there to teach them. They were foster kids, totally neglected kids, and they built that library. About 13 or 14 years later, these folks from Wisconsin saw this, and then they founded what they call the Little Free Library kind of movement. But we already had this. From this going forward, neighborhoods all over the city were building these little places to give away books, share books, and, you know. But the main thing it's doing, besides modeling ecological sustainability and youth engagement and service learning and, you know, celebrating education, and an economy of sharing, was to put it in public space and say, the whole grid needs to change. Because this is the coolest thing about living in an empire, which we do. The empire homogenizes people in order to control us. And anywhere where an exception happens within the grid, it becomes of super freaking awesome interest to everyone everywhere. Like, oh, I could do that too, in my own way, with my children. Okay, so here's the coolest truck in the world. This, we realized, okay, so the city council legalized the transformation of street intersections for free, but none of the media told anyone. Like, you go to the newspaper and expect to see it on the front page. Hey everyone, public space, at last. No. So we thought, all right, well that's fine. We'll just turn that into an opportunity. So we took an old truck. Like, I can't tell you how many people were connected. There was a mechanic who could fix a truck. There was somebody with an old truck. We had somebody who was growing bamboo in their yard. We made this thing called the tea horse. We built it inside of the tea house that the city had told us we had to get rid of. So before it was taken away, or we had to take it apart, we built this butterfly inside that would go out into the city and bring the whole idea of a radical gathering place all across the city, so that every neighborhood would get, you know, basically get the news that something had become possible. So it would go to parking lots and parks and block parties. Basically, people would be waiting for it, and Persian rugs and pillows would spill all around the truck. So it was a gathering place catalyst that would inspire people to talk to each other and start to figure out that there were these new tools available for creating their own gathering places out of their own existing public space. So this would go around the city like this, 28 different events to make a giant circle, and then we united all of those points together in people holding hands around the city, standing in the streets and just stopping traffic and saying, "This is our city." And then the TV picked up on it like, well, that's too cool to kind of not cover. So they did it. The whole thing is about the barn raising. It's about all these layers, like restoring public space, stewardship culture, mentoring children, you know, the barn raising once again, community ritual, restoring the architecture of community, you know. So this is what we're facing. Like, this is not just abstract. Look at how this works. This is an aerial view of a Dogon village in Africa that looks exactly like my own villages of the Celtic people from a couple of thousand years ago, with circular blocks that have open spaces in the middle and intersections that are great crossroads where people come together informally and cyclically and annually for all manner of things that bring them together. And over here you can see, yeah, there's pathways, there's blocks, there's intersections, just like over there, except over here they get to design their own reality directly, and over here we live in a design system that from the East Coast to the West Coast, in spite of thousands of years of village culture, is absent any kind of place in the middle or the possibility of coming together. It's nullified. So I'm not trying to bring that up in order to feel depressed, because all of this presentation is about radical transformations. And I can tell you, like, the consequence of doing this is to grow, to make more friends. Like, it fuels you to do this work, you know, and to find your voice and to become more powerful that way, to cultivate the voice in your children. So look at this, whether it's long, straight, flat lines like we have around here, or these seductive kind of curves of the suburbs, the main issue begins with the idea that this is a design system that is unresponsive to the people who live there. There was this young woman named Lizzie Magie who invented the game Monopoly at the beginning of the last century as a way to help Americans understand that in 1785, the National Land Ordinance imposed the Roman colonial grid over everything all the way to the Pacific Ocean to facilitate westward expansion, and the erasure of native patterns, native settlement patterns, native economies, everything. And you know, when you've played this game, I hope you've noticed very quickly that the only form of commons is a jail and a parking lot. Like, you should be asking, like, where's the library? Where's the civic center? Where's the city hall? You know, where's a park? Where's a public square? Like, nothing. You just get to choose to be a little pony or a race car or a shoe maybe, and go around and around. And the way Lizzie invented it, like, you see, eventually somebody's off the board, and at the end, if you can even stand to get there, like, there's only one person left with any power whatsoever, and that's playing America. Okay, this is my daughter. She gives me hope through everything. She's like a lightning bolt of just joy all the time, irrepressible. So she's this little model of a human being, and I just see in her the unfolding all the time, that which gives me hope, and I think sustains most everyone, to see that we have this limitless proclivity. If only we can throw off being repressed and taught that we can't, made to feel bad about ourselves, or whatever the constraint is. So far she hasn't learned about that, so she's just crushing it all the time. But it's this. See this diagram? This is the diagram of the great human village. I submit to you, after traveling so far and learning so much about villages, there is this diagram that celebrates the fact that the universe, like the life force, the principles of the universe are expressed through circles and spheres and cycles all around us. And that is all inside of every one of us, waiting to come out and be expressed and then reflected back to us so we can see who we are. So, okay, we're going to launch in now. We looked at how a typical person lives inside of the grid right now. Like a typical single woman gets in her car, she takes her child to school, then she runs over to the doctor, and then she gets into a truck because she fixes roofs for a living. She goes over to fix a roof way across town. She comes back, and then she's running around in her car to get some food and meet some friends. So what's important to realize, she's a roofer, and she's surrounded by people in a working class neighborhood who need their roofs fixed. They can't afford it, or she doesn't know them, so she's always leaving to go elsewhere, taking her time and her energy and her resources just to move around. So what is important that we've realized is that in every freaking neighborhood, every single mother with children is surrounded by all of the people that she would ever need to ask for help. And that's one of the biggest problems we have, is we're terrified of each other and even asking for help. But we're surrounded. She's surrounded by the doctor, the teacher, the people with roofs needing fixing. All of these skills and talents in every single neighborhood are all around us, and yet we feel alone and separate. That's the power of the Roman grid. Oh, take that personally. It was done to your people. It was done to your ancestors. So this is our strategy. Anywhere in the Roman grid becomes a leverage point to inspire systemic transformation. Like this. Boom! You know what we're seeing? They're actually painting over about 10 years of murals right here, because this neighborhood every year comes together, includes all the children, and they come up with a new design, and then they paint it again and again. But the plan is to tear up the whole street. It's actually to put in this big, beautiful, convex, permeable platform with a finished permanent design. But we're like having so much fun doing this huge metaphorical art project that we haven't stopped yet to figure out what the design actually will end up being. So here's what's going on. The adults always think they've got it figured out until just at the end of the design process, the children come sweeping in. And they're like, we figured it out. And the adults are like, what is it this time? And they're like, it's going to be a spiral yellow brick road. From the edge to the center, you're going to have 4 directional Wizard of Oz characters. And then as it comes into the center, it'll go right into the manhole cover and wake up a Tyrannosaurus Rex, who will come out of the manhole cover to eat cars, because cars are burning fossil fuels, and those are the bodies of dinosaurs. And wouldn't Superman want to help and go like, let's get rid of this damn thing, and put it into the Tyrannosaurus Rex's mouth? And we're just like, of course. We should have seen that the whole time. So, we've been facilitating the voice of children in this placemaking process for more than 2 decades now. And I am very happy to report to you, there's never any vandalism. And the consequence of doing that is we're like, oh, vandalism happens because you're not doing this. Like, that's why, children have all this, irrepressible energy to express. So to create a context or a field or a palette for them to constructively engage is what's been missing the whole time. Okay, so the American Journal of Public Health and the New England Journal, which are the 2 preeminent journals in the world, measured this thing and some control intersections to figure out what the benefit was. And they're like, my God, they're working with garbage and paint, and they're becoming mentally and physically healthier. Like, we're actually getting out and interacting, and we don't feel alone, and we're going to people's houses and working on projects together like villagers. And so the city council calls us in, and they're like, where's this going? What's really the big vision? So we brought with us a map of the 95 neighborhoods of Portland. We just put little stickers on each neighborhood. And we're like, we have no freaking idea. We just know that people are frustrated, isolated, and voiceless everywhere. And so they need to be able to create a reflection of who they've become. I want to just say, so much of the time when people create public space, they're like, let's go to the great Gothic spaces of Europe and gather these beautiful ideas, because those are so beautiful. No, those are ancient places that crystallize a mentality of what culture was like before a lot of people were even considered human, fully human. So what gets me out of bed is I want to see, before I'm dead, all over the place, people creating public spaces that look like who we have become. Like people who embrace our connection to nature and are open to the broadest possible diversity of the human family, and celebrate that. What are we made of? Let's see. And for people who are scared and don't want to try it out, they may only see that one horizon their whole life that they don't go to. But when we go to that horizon and we do that thing, we see another one Like I would say to you about Portland, Oregon, in spite of what you've heard about it, it has so many problems, like so many places, and some of them are worse than others, but people are running to the horizon. Like, I want to see what's possible. So many things, like, but what we didn't show the city council was what we called the sacred napkin of world peace. We literally had this discussion as a core group. We're like, where could all this go? Like, we think systemically. We're really into ecological design. Like, gardens and forests are all these networks of living systems. And we're like, boy, that sure looks like the map of the world. And we looked and we're like, yeah, cities and towns communicate constantly with political and economic communication systems and stories traveling all the time. So if we just focus on transforming our town, we will inspire people to transform their own. Because they'll be like, yeah, I can do that too, in our own way. So this is the plan. And of course it's like think global and act local. So fortunately we had this brilliant 13-year-old young woman who was part of the initial intersection process. And she did a chart of what everyone did for a living around the intersection we had painted. And she brought it to a meeting of adults, and she's like, adults, I've brought all these crayons for you. You could connect the dots and see how we could all be working together. And the adults are like, well, there really is a chef, and we all like to eat. Let's see, there's a social worker. We got a lot of problems. There's a community worker. We're becoming a community. Hell, there's an ironsmith, a carpenter, a plumber, an electrician, a landscaper, a whole bunch of carpenters. Geez, and in 5 minutes it looked like this. And that's what I'm saying. Everybody's there. Everybody's there. Okay, so that's a whole lot of talk. And for me, I've always needed to like have a point to focus on. Like, what's the point of everything we're trying to do when we go to work every day thinking the world might be getting better? Here's this image. For us as a core group, like our core philosophy is that the revolution we seek, like in terms of being accessible and equitable, it has to be one where anyone, anywhere can make change happen, you know, wherever they are right now. But even more importantly, anyone, anywhere needs to be able to love whoever they love, however they love, right now, outwardly, in public space. Like, that's the guiding light. That's the North Star of all this work. You know, and we're into green roofs and bioswales and straw bale houses and all that stuff. But all that stuff takes care of itself if we take care of this. That's what we think. And as we're doing that, to rejoin with nature, to make space for native pollinators, species of every kind in all the human environments that we are engendering. So to make change, it helps to go to where the heat is, to go to where the distress is, to support people in what they want to do. So in this case, working in, this is the first DIY tiny home-based village in the country, started back in 1999, and unsurprisingly, it's called Dignity Village. The anti-camping ordinance had just been overturned, so all these people were camping together and they refused to be swept. The police would sweep them anyway, but they would always stay together. And their numbers swelled. They had huge shopping cart parades going through the city. And people were like wondering, like helicopters would follow them from the news, like, where are they going next? And then they would start strategically locating right in the middle of like a condo development or something. And so it was freaking out the ruling class. So finally, the city council gave them an acre and a half in a place that was politically safe for them. And they were able to start creating the village. And they were doubting that this could ever succeed. But the proposal that the homeless or houseless people were making was that if they can be able to be stable somewhere, then they can get out of the doorways and out from under bridges and stuff and stop being perceived of as an issue by others while they take care of themselves. And they were appealing to people, like emotionally, like women would stand up there and say, can you imagine what it's like for me to be out in the streets every night? You know? That was a question that was asked of me as someone held my hands and as I was about to start attending meetings. And it was a completely mortifying, life-changing moment to be asked that question, because I can't even imagine what the answer really is like. So here we are, 24 years later. It's the flagship of the country. The police are like, you know what's really weird? They've literally done all these studies of the impact of Dignity Village. It has the lowest crime rate in all the city. It has the lowest carbon footprint of all. It has the highest rate of political participation, not just in voting, but in terms of the fact that everyone here is part of a culture of mutual responsibility, of accountability. And all these damaged, traumatized people come into it, including people with intense criminal records. But because living and working are integrated in one place, they run their own place, it creates the perfect conditions of actual freaking human habitat that enable people to heal and become powerful. I can't even relate how powerful it is to have witnessed people go from basically being almost completely non-functional and sociopathic to becoming the chairman of a village who runs a nonprofit, you know, which is how they kind of accept donations here. So it has its own village economy, and now it's entirely economically self-supporting as well, with all these micro-enterprises that exist inside of it. So this is a little village, a little neighborhood in the village. It's filled with gathering places, all these places for people to be with each other and do projects. There's offices, there's workshops, there's all these materials. The flows that come into this, like the city forester brings trees that have been felled for them to cut apart and split and then cure and make available for Portlanders as firewood fuel in the wintertime. Lots of other stories like that where basically they're making a living using resource flows that would otherwise maybe end up in a landfill. This is the second one in the city called R2D2, which means the right to dream too. So their case is that if you can pull over on a freeway and be able to sleep for 12 hours because you're driving a car, you ought to be able to pull your shopping cart over and have 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep somewhere in the city. So they actually used the rest stop code in their project. And so this is run by basically about a dozen Mother Teresas, bringing all of these people in from the streets to have a safe place to sleep every night. It has no funding, nobody's paid, and it's just these people who, it's just so inspiring. It makes you cry. Like, I've heard people say, like, well, what about you? Don't you need money? Don't you need a job? Like, don't you need your own place? And I'm like, no, there's so many people that are in distress. They need help. They're, like, when you see houseless people living in the streets, you see them strung out or whatever, please know that in the midst of all those people are these incredible human beings that should probably be the president or something. Another one, the Kenton Women's Village. Like, there's so many stories to tell about all these villages, but this is the one that broke through all the opposition. All these architecture firms got together to design and build beautiful, luminous, little tiny homes. And the stories were so attractive that nobody thought it was a bad idea. Not even right-wing media was trying to confuse the story. And so neighborhoods were calling the people organizing this and saying, can we have that come to our neighborhood? We would like to take care of the domestic violence survivor and abuse and houseless women, abuse victims, but basically all women in that village. And so suddenly you had a place-based, beautiful DIY village that nobody wanted to say no to. And that led to many more places saying this was a good idea. Even conservative Oregon City. And they're like, okay, we've got about $700,000, the equivalent of a single family home around here, to spend. Can we house 32 people in 32 different units with an infirmary and a commercial kitchen and a community hall and places to wash and do your laundry? And this is what we were able to create with the cost of one single family house. And this is for veterans. So you might wonder, like, how do you get all of these things done? The truth is, there's a subculture involved in every one of these. And in this case, it was the military. So, like, the Army showed up and the Air Force and the Navy to build this thing for these people. So it was a truly mighty demonstration of the potential, where all these doubters are like, oh no, this won't even happen. You don't have enough money. But you have the muscle of the society showing up. Okay, A lot of times people don't even have the dignity of having a place to relieve themselves. So this is one of the prototypes that we've developed that we're now making available to all these other cities, where people are able to go into what's called the Portland Loo. It started with a community design process and eventually led to a funded position and then the creation of a prototype that's all over the city now, where people can just simply have the dignity of having some place like this available.
There's one in Arcata.
Oh really? Same kind?
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Just like it.
That's it. So another example of going to distress. Here's a street in Duncan, British Columbia, where people are dealing drugs. Basically, a lot of murders happen almost every night. This intense catastrophe happens, and the people who live around it, the businesses on the edge of this street, are at the end of their wits. So of course the way you engage an issue like this is you bring everyone, including the drug dealers, the houseless people, into a community process. You afford everyone the dignity and respect of their, of their presence. You appreciate them. And then you start talking about what you love about the neighborhood and what's working, so that then when you talk about what needs to change, you're building on what you love. And in the end of this process, we end up with 5 different layers of interventions, from improved pedestrian kind of crossings and safety, to orchards and edible landscapes, native plant environments, restored storefronts, community murals, lots of placemaking, and then housing for the houseless people on the rooftops of the businesses. Because the idea being, like, they're there, it's their space too, and if they could be employed to take care of the space, then it would be it would have some stewardship, and they wouldn't be houseless anymore, and they would have some resource, and actually everything would end up costing less, because doing nothing always costs more, and you can quote me on that to your mayor. Okay, so this is what it looks like on the ground level. Like, the idea isn't to drive people out, it's to bring more people in and make the environment attractive so that it really does look like a 21st century street. So artistic gestures like convex traffic, crossing, narrowing the aperture of the street with bioswales and native plants and trees, a gathering place at the central crossroads of the street that celebrates the different businesses that are along the street. So this car mechanic can bring his cars out into the street and have some sort of festival. The music shop can have concerts out there. So using public space to actually showcase everybody who's there. There's a police station on this street where all these murders are happening. So we're like, okay, obviously they need a porch where everyone can sit and have coffee, including the police, talking to people, not just arresting them and attacking them. There needs to be a place for them all to be able to go to the bathroom here, and another place here for snacks. And and here you can see some of the houseless village stuff happening on the roof. So beauty, ecology, place, connection, should be the fundamental baseline for everyone anyway. And then this is looking at it, and it's really just a beginning, because we're hoping to gel something that continues to grow and expand. All right, so looking at a typical American neighborhood of placelessness, it's really helpful to know some of the stuff, all the great work that's been done toward re-villaging American neighborhoods. So this man named Kevin Lynch wrote a book called The Image of the City. He did a survey of the robust villages around the world that had the most intergenerational community and continuity, and even strong economy and artistic expression. He said how interesting, they had such a powerful sense of place. They had a kind of overall beautifulness to them that they had arrived at, but at the center of every kind of group of people living in a town scale, there was always a heart or a village center. There was always a great commons. Then there were always gateways where you would celebrate your entry into the community, or it would invite you to come back. That the pathways people traveled were interesting and beautiful. And they weren't just straight lines. They were curving, and they would rise and fall, so you would always know the kind of shape of the land that you're on. Then there would be nodes of all these different activities, and somehow people would be helped to know where these activities were happening. And then there was a place where all the stories that happened in the village were marked through public art, or some kind of fountain, or or perhaps a plaque. So looking at the typical American neighborhood here, you have lots of housing, again without gathering places. You have main streets and then these commercial corridors called out in red, but no public square, as we've been saying. Okay, so I don't know if you can see this, but our first intervention, strategic leverage point, is to go to the entry to the neighborhood and create something that tells people that they've arrived. So you start to build community identity as people just flow in and out of the space. And that can start in a lot of simple ways. A lot of people are like, okay, let's work for a year and a half just to get the Department of Transportation to say yes so we can put in a sign. There's other ways you can do that more directly and more beautifully with creative artistic interventions using flowers, things hanging from trees. There's just a jillion ways to get started. And then your main social leverage points are to do these incredible enhancements, just like places for information, artistic expression, a place to sit at the main intersections in the neighborhood. And then there's already things happening in the neighborhood that a lot of people aren't aware of. So whether it's a website or a map or some wayfinding signage in the neighborhood, you start to call out to people that there really are destinations in the neighborhood that people can have available to go and visit. Hello, sweetie. And then in their minds, or you literally create some way of expressing it, they start to connect all of this together, not just in terms of the grid network, but in the way that they see how these things all connect in their minds, or perhaps on a map. And then all these little squares, there's just tons of things, whether it's art in somebody's front yard, or a little free library, or a certain kind of birdhouse. And I'm talking about just the little things that you start with that start to add up into a place that's already quite amazing, but people haven't really seen it as a whole yet. So how do you do that? Here's an example. Go ahead.
I want to share an experience that we have 3 years ago in Colombia. There was a kind of civil war, and all the city like super into this stuff to build in the main street, like in that like crossing the streets, like a little village to hold people in the middle of that this like riot. And part of that strategy was also making like free libraries. So people just donate their books, and there was like a place not only to like be against the who were like fighting the police in that case, but also like there was habitating children's, playing around because the library was there. There was like workshops happening, free access. And that kind of what you were describing, that was what happened, but pretty into it. People don't know anything about like architecture. There was like any kind of professional about it, but just like the place is showing the people when we are articulated what to do, even in these great places in the middle of the city.
Yeah.
And one of the main things was libraries bring like that diversity of children and also adults, not only that adults is there, and that bring that vibe of fresh air to safe spaces for all of us, and also or just comunitarias that means public pots, but it's like somebody just put in the middle of the street a huge pot, and you prepare soap for all the community, so everybody just bring in whatever they have. So it's gonna be hard for police just to fuck with what is happening, because you just have a crowd of people eating all together in these public places. So yeah, I just feel.
She gave you the stick.
You were talking stick.
Good job. Yeah, I'm really like surprised about what you were describing. It's something that happened with people really into it, was coming to be together against that police repression. So and it worked. Also like creating monuments different than what we have already set up in the city, like monuments made by people, like what is really that character in our own story, like in this neighborhood, in your neighborhood. They said, how I have a grandma that was like building something in my like write straight my corner or a teacher. So like building these symbolic things, not by somebody else, just like making it happen, make a lot of sense to be habitated in the space. Like the spaces that used to be also like around like violence and insecurity turns with another vibe since people is up there like with a like bigger with a bigger purpose like a library or communal pod or or an art gallery or there is so many things, but I just want to share that.
And tomorrow you will be speaking at one of those places. That community garden is exactly that. That's exciting.
Thanks for the point. Thank you for that promotional. Well, I'm interested in doing this kind of activism because it's really about what brings us together. So I'm not surprised at all. People are in a circumstance where they can express themselves and they're to be powerful and to have a voice. This stuff emerges out of people. I'm not really showing anything original, I think. It just looks original when you've not seen it for a while, I guess. But thanks.
Will you say the name of that book that had the different points of the...
Oh, The Image of the City.
Okay, thank you so much.
I forgot. I brought like 5 books in case anybody wants our version of that kind of stuff. I forgot to bring it in, but it's in my truck. We've evolved Kevin Lynch's, the way that he identifies it into that set that I showed you. Okay, so this is a group of people working again in Duncan, British Columbia, and they've realized in their town they don't have a village center, they don't have a public square in the center. And so this is what it looks like to go through a design process. And what we like to do is what we call democratizing design. So, if everybody's kind of drawing things, you sort of, a lot of people aren't comfortable because they haven't been practicing drawing, and and a lot of people say, I can't draw. But when you have colorful paper and scissors and tape and glue sticks, people can really go to town. Everyone can create that way because it's maybe what we've done before. So when we have a design dialogue around transforming public space, we try to take it into a forum, a kind of a medium where people are comfortable expressing ideas. So you see a lot of different designs being tested here. And then as professionals, then we take what people have done and try to synthesize it together into a next round of options. People come to that gathering to kind of express their perspective on each of the different designs until eventually, through iterations of community input, it ends up being one final design where everything kind of flows into one synthesis. So there's a lot to say about this. I think the things that I love the most are this integration of nature, and then the fact that the native tribe next to the town is showcased with all of these totems, not just in the public square, but really throughout the town. So they're trying to affect a healing process through this kind of artistic, inclusive approach. And then when you get into the site and you start looking around at the design, you see all of these things that are expressing the preferences of children, the preferences of elders, in the way that the things that happen in the space and how it's created as a place where so many things can happen all at once in the same space. And then here's one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen. This is where a man living at the house behind this installation had just read an article about how American men typically are very self-interested and are not tending to be supportive or facilitative. And I know the story because he was my friend. He puts down the magazine and he goes across the street to this little girl. Walked up to her and he said, "What would you like to do? What do you think would make the neighborhood a better place?" And so after their discussion, it was decided to create this place that felt like you were in the ocean. And part of the idea was that she would have a mermaid big sister, because she didn't have a big sister. So if you look closely, you can see that there's this mermaid in the bench, And because she wanted to be able to hug her big sister, there's a way to reach behind the cob mermaid for her to be able to hug. And here you see she's grown up from being 7 years old to being a bit of a mermaid herself. And through the transparent roof you can see that there's this lighthouse that glows at night with solar power. There's an information kiosk, a sacred niche, and another little library woven into it. This is where somebody's saying, I just want to give up part of my yard and allow people to come across the line. I'll take that risk and I'll bring people together and be propelled by the vision of a little girl. This is one of the most exquisite places I've seen in all the world. And it shifted me to see, like, to ask myself, like, what would the world, maybe little girls need to be telling us what the world needs to look like. Because certainly my archetype has kind of been fucking it up. So here we are looking at a typical block. Now, one of the things we realized throughout this process is that like access to professional design services is itself a social justice issue. Literally, I have seen people come into an architecture office and be like, almost, I want to destroy the world. Can you give me a floor plan for that? Like, and when you're creating a giant office park, that's basically what you're saying. I want to mow down the native ecology, or I want to mow down like farmland, tear down orchards, and put in a damn office park that nobody really needs or wants. So here we are working with working class folk and design students from our permaculture class, engage each family and create master plans that basically help them figure out how to create perennial and annual gardens, how to retrofit their homes to be more energy efficient, and then how to take down fences and put in pathways that connect them all together, along with all of these other common spaces like play spaces for kids, community meeting house, you know, a bike repair facility, a tool library, and just tons of other things. So to go into action, because I actually live on this block, so I had a lot of interest in creating this. You can see fences have come down. There's a gathering place in the center for everyone to be able to come in, and whether it's barbecuing or having your children play there, everybody has access to the space. And then looking kind of more deeply, we created a model of the entire block, which took a little while to make, but then it helped us decide where to put our tiny homes. This is actually a teeny home here, to take down more fences and then to put in a community sauna. Unsurprisingly, when all these people are getting connected where they live, they start to want to take off their clothes. So they need a community sauna. This is Adriana, and she's our local naturopathic doctor, and she established a whole new basis of clientele by being so connected to the neighborhood that she actually opened up her office in her front living room and then created a waiting room made of cob out of her front porch, and then added a straw bale extension for a new living room, which then, you know, set the precedent for legal straw bale construction in the city. And in her basement, she created a zero carbon nursery school. So anybody who can come from within walking distance with their children and not emit carbon through the commute can bring their child there. So all this social, cultural, ecological innovation coming out of the opportunity of people being connected locally. Now this is one of my favorite examples, and I'm really excited for you to see this, Julie, because this is my house on the block, where I have lived with, you know, multiple adults and children, where we have shared ownership of the place, because none of us could afford a house individually, so we bought it together. And this is the sanctuary I was telling you about that's based on womb space. Again, you walk in there, you're like, oh, this is so fun. This is so nice. So you're living in a living garden, and we've turned the house into a community center. We've retrofitted we've stuffed the walls full of straw clay insulation, which was illegal. But we have so many friends in the city who are like, whoops, we did this thing. So it gets legalized. And I'm super paraphrasing because we had to do a little bit of work. But we were trying to make straw clay legal for everybody. So the house is wrapped in all of this cob earthen plaster, mosaic glass set into the earthen plaster, and then treated, kind of painted with linseed oil. And then all of these living roofs are floating over parts of the buildings on the land. This is as you approach the porch. You're just really walking into a living garden surrounded by food forests. So vertical gardens of up to 6 layers or 7 layers of productivity, all happening in the same vertical space. So from edible ground cover and mushrooms to small shrubs, vines weaving up through the whole design, and then smaller like dwarf trees, larger trees, all bearing food in the same space. Here's the former garage turned into a little house. Here's a greenhouse on the south side, kind of turning the house into an earth ship, but just using windows out of the waste stream and fitting them together to make a greenhouse. And then water catchment, so we catch all the water, off of the roof into these above ground rain barrels. So we're constantly taking stuff out of the waste stream and turning it into a useful technology. So here's more of the living roofs on the site. Here's a picture of that womb space. And then these are little tiny homes on the block made of, this is a load-bearing circular straw bale, cylindrical straw bale. This is the moon cottage made of straw clay and earth and plaster. And then this is a timber frame straw clay house. So, the people who are living there are people who built it for themselves using recycled and natural materials. And then they build this as part of our barn raising that happens every June. So tons of people come to learn and then get these skills, and they help to build, and then people are able to have a place to live while everyone else gets reskilled. Go ahead.
How big are the tiny houses, and do you have like a little kitchenette and bathroom?
Yeah, some of them do. Don't. Like this one is just a one-room space, and that one is where it's basically like what you would call a detached bedroom, and they have access to the bathroom and the kitchen of the main house. Same with this one. This one is a fully self-sufficient little house with a kitchenette and a bathroom. And let's see, these two are 120 square feet, and then the code was changed because these are so popular, yet illegal. But the city decided to allow people to do that up to 200 square feet. So.
Do you ever have challenges with access for handicapped people? And have you guys challenges?
Yeah. Well, whether you're building a kind of a little DIY thing like this, or doing a permitted version.
I meant more. I'm sorry, for like when you guys do the square, like the in the streets. Like, have there ever been challenges with that where people like who are dependent on like motorized access to get to their house? Or I don't know. I'm just curious because my parents are handicapped, and I was like, it looks very cool, but then I kind of feel like I wonder how they would be able to get around. Or,
You mean to get to their house with a car?
Yeah, like that.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. Have they come up as concerns, or what kind of?
Well, the only time that the painted intersections are closed is when people are either installing them or maintaining them or having like a big party there.
Oh, okay. So the streets are still really open.
Yeah.
Still with traffic.
And what's really lovely is like, if somebody's coming home and they need to get through a traffic barricade, I'm serious, like, in the case of our neighborhood, you have the 4 square blocks of core people, all knowing that they already went to the store and that you're going to need to open it for them when they're coming home. But the rest of the time, people are able to flow through. It's just that their behavior changes when they go through the space so that they slow down. The thing is, we really do want, this is a catalyst toward closing the street permanently. And even in that case, if you didn't have a roadway 30 to 40 feet wide, you would at least have a lane that might curve. That would be something like 8 to 10 feet wide for emergency vehicles or just everyone's access. So.
I do have experience converting like retired alleyways into green spaces because I live in a community with alleys we've already kind of taken up space to enroll it. Like it's a whole 8 block. We've met a lot of our neighbors. That's something that I just never met anybody with an answer to it. Like we don't use them anymore. It used to be when you put your trash can out, they all go to the front. Nobody uses them anymore. It's just an art block now. But about turning that into green space. A lot of the neighbors have been really interested in ambient block parties, everything you're talking about. They're kind of primed for that. I've never had support from the city. I've actually had resistance from the city, which makes sense based on your presentation. But how would we get around that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a thing.
Am I being ahead of you? I know you're kind of going.
No, that's all right. So, this is something that people could have explained to them in like how the system works. Basically, the way that the ownership and the lines are drawn in every American town and city is, suburbs are slightly different, but first the grid is drawn, it's just squares. And I'm getting to an answer. And then through an ordinance, a right of way is established that creates the roads. But the system is set up so that you can revert the right of way back to private ownership. It's designed to all ultimately be privatized if landowners want that. So it's called street vacation. It's called the vacating of the street, and it's right there for sure in your city charter that streets can be vacated, especially if everyone on that alley agrees. And of course the city's going to push back, but the way I'd start it is to get the goals and objectives. They're oftentimes called benchmarks of the city, and you'll see this amazing list of things that really look like community objectives, but that the city has embraced as goals that they don't address. So you can grab those, put those into what you're proposing, get everyone's signature on the street and say, we want to close our alley, and we want to do this because of all these benchmark reasons that are irrefutable by them. Okay, so, and if you have anything else that you want to, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to ask you mentioned something about a barn race that happens every June. Where can we get information about that? Will we come up and learn?
Yeah, you can go to cityrepair.org and there'll be information there.
Thank you.
Let me explain.
Sorry, to be like a little bit more. How many signatures do you think it would take? Does it have to be just if two people are like, yeah, we're doing it, we can do it? Is there like of signatures I'm going to might need?
To make it most compelling, it would be the owners of the houses. And,
But how many? Like, if there was like just this every single one, or how long does the stretch have to be? Because some of us there's 3 houses on a block, some are longer.
I think it would be most persuasive if it was everyone in that alley, renters and owners, because then they couldn't say that there was some people that didn't agree. But get as far as you can with whoever makes the difference. Cityrepair.org.
Like the Village Rebuilding, Village Building Festival, right?
The Village Building Convergence.
Convergence.
Or VBC. This is VBC 23 this year. So it started in 2009. Yeah, so it's happening on June 10th through 17th, and there are going to be dozens of projects, including street paintings, garden projects, probably some building projects. It's a giant tree house, a really huge tree house. Yeah, and it's just kind of getting its legs under it again, because during the pandemic, there was a lot of breakdown of our kind of activist core. So we're just kind of getting it back. Like we used to have almost 50 projects happening at the same time during that pandemic. But the cool thing is if you come, like during the day there are projects, and then in the evening there's community dinners and there's presentations and things. So it's really set up to be like a building festival. That's how it's like. We haven't got that set up yet, but if you check in and you can ask that question, that will help you get homestays going. Because we used to figure out homestays. So I would try to make that happen if you told me. Yeah, that's the way homestays happen for sure. Yeah. Okay. Oh, so like important to be ridiculous. So here we have the Chicken Palace, which we're really playing with, like, maybe some of you might have heard of Christopher Alexander, and he's got this idea of how human beings design. So we're sort of making fun of Christopher Alexander, who's just like this wise genius, by designing chicken patterns. So it's like, wouldn't chickens love an egg-shaped house? Wouldn't they want it to remind them of their mother's like long skinny legs? Wouldn't they want their front porch to be this recycled plexiglass chicken beak shaped front porch roof? You know, and then the weather vane doesn't have a chicken on it, but it has people. So we're totally playing all the time. And then here's a tree house for my daughter on this site. And it's just literally taking branches and making a huge kind of basket up in the branches of this dwarf cherry tree. So she just has a little bit set of stairs, and she and her little friends can get up there and just sit in the pillows in this bird nest, basically. So that block is very motivated, and we plant perennial gardens around the block. So you can see we're putting in a food forest here in the grass strips around the block. And then neighbors have got, families have gotten together to take somebody's yard who's involved and tear it up and put in a garlic patch. So this is all about doing work and then having food together. And on that same block, a community orchard, and also over here, just this amazing demonstration garden of perennial vegetables. So instead of the annual vegetables that you're used to, things like obviously asparagus and artichokes and different kinds of onions or perennial kale. So this garden is entirely self-generating, requiring less maintenance and less inputs of water. So here's the model of our block, and we very seriously play the game of life with this model. And while we're at it, we rethink the streets and all the intersections, and obviously we're wanting more space to plant for food security and for beauty. So organized community power in public space. Here's another street intersection. They take on so many different forms, but each one has this vision of using the painted intersection as a catalyst for more things to happen. So here in this neighborhood, we were asking ourselves, like literally this is an illustration, it's going to sound silly, but the workshop was, what would world peace look like? Like, I know that seems ridiculous, but like we have the right to ask that question and come up with an answer. So we took an afternoon and people, we started off like this, just close your eyes and imagine what it would smell like. What would it taste like or feel like to live in a place where you woke up in the morning and you weren't beset by anxiety? Like, what would it feel like? So we're illustrating all these places on the corners where our teenagers have a place to work while they stay, present in our lives. There's community fountains, there's a flower shop, there's a big tea house, there's a place for community news and vegetables and fruit. And you see all of these kind of different changes happening in the neighborhood where change is literally driven from within rather than visited from without in the form of gentrification. Like the core idea here is to grow community power so that we really establish new institutions and we don't allow that violence upon us. It's, again, like in permaculture we say, English ivy, that invasive, only thrives in the absence of the ecology that should be inherent to that place. So invasiveness and violence is happening in the place of what would otherwise be there. So I'm really proud to tell you that our Department of Transportation is really more like a Department of Transformation now. And you can actually get this document from them, and they're offering it to cities all over the continent for how to repurpose the public right-of-way and enable people to use it as a cultural space once again for free. And this is really the joy of their work now. To be able to install raised planters in every single residential right-of-way across the city. To be able to plant fruit and nut trees everywhere, now legal. Community kiosks, any kind of interactive facility can be installed right in front of your house, on the edge of your yard if you want, or out in the grass strip, the boulevard, and it's for free. I mean, it's free of permit and you're automatically insured for doing it. Raised trellises, planters in the street to slow down cars while you provide habitat for pollinators. Covered bike parking facilities right there in the street. Of course, solar-powered cob kiosk, benches, and then this is the coolest thing of all, I think, community composting facilities right there in the right-of-way. And on, and on, and on. Okay, so here's the Sunnyside neighborhood saying, let's put the sunflower down in the street. That's the emblem of the neighborhood. This is a huge one, celebrating the major flora and fauna of the Northwest region. This is even bigger. This is a congressional delegation from Washington, D.C. coming to see how this all works so they can take it back to their communities. This is in front of the Portland Opera. It's happening all over and in downtown, like this, where whole streets are being closed. Like when people were saying initially, why don't we just close streets? We knew that we couldn't just close streets. So the mayor said, okay, I know that's what you want, but to get there, you have to start with where people can say yes and build a lot of momentum and vision, and then go to the next yes and the next yes, because it's a process. And so, like, we always wanted to close streets, and now it's happening in the heart of the city. And then out in the neighborhood, right now, whole sections of streets are being closed as permanent public spaces, and not just street murals. This is one out in the suburbs now that was just completed and designed through a community process. This is a large apartment building out in the outer part of the city, where an entire parking lot has been taken up to put in some of the most spectacular gardens, regenerative gardens in the city. I'm basically talking about how a neighborhood infills. Again, about one thing leading to another. These are all these social service agencies that are now run by the people that are affected. So this is a facility inspired by houseless people to be a place for them to be able to receive mail, use computers, use phones, get showers, get hygiene, like supplies and stuff, that is organized and run by houseless people for themselves. This is where day laborers go to find jobs to work in the day. They've organized to create their own facility for, out of which they're organizing, to attract jobs to support their families. This is the rebuilding center of Our United Villages, and this building is the leading kind of sort of habitat rebuild store, resale store in the country, except it's called the Rebuilding Center. It's made out of all natural and recycled materials, and it was built really engaging the community within 4 blocks, especially this giant cob entry here. But the coolest thing is you can't work here unless you come from within walking distance, so there's no carbon in your commute, and everyone who works here runs the building together, runs the business together in a cooperative enterprise. So it's really, it's a form of permaculture in every dimension possible. And then the building itself is making, it redirects materials out of the waste stream. So instead of going to the dump, all these materials are made available to the community again. So any demolition project in the city can send its materials to this place where people will recondition it, pull out nails, clean up toilets, and make them available to people again. So all of that activity, suddenly we got this call from the Rockefeller Foundation to redesign San Francisco. I know, we're suddenly jumping to a huge scale, and the 10 teams from around the world were invited to come and redesign 3 to 5 cities in the Bay Area. And the Rockefeller people said, I know you're not going to trust us. This is going to sound crazy, but we've realized everyone needs to be on the lifeboat toward the future. And we're committed to this thing called the 100 Cities Initiative. We need you to show us designs that center disenfranchised people and tell us how to repurpose streets. And I was just like, am I dead? Like, what? What? And they included us because we were this little permaculture outfit that they thought might bring some unusual dimension to the design. And I think so, because we had outrageous ideas. For San Francisco, we proposed, well, first of all, we realized, there's a drought. We wanted to address the drought. And we did some calculations, and we realized that San Francisco gets enough rain on itself to meet all of its needs through the course of a year. But they have a system that's designed to get rid of the water, to just get the hell out of here kind of thing, down into the bay where it actually pollutes. So working with some of the leading gray water and black water designers in the world on our team, we installed this vision of how everyone could just use the same domestic systems that are already legal in places like New Mexico or Arizona for water catchment and gray water, and that are legal in places like New York for black water, and that are already available in every city on the continent around like capturing runoff from streets. And we designed it into the system, but that wasn't enough. So the proposal is mainly based on converting the sewer system for getting rid of the water into a water catchment system, this gigantic existing system for catching the water. And so we did a bunch of calculations for how that would work in a home, calculations for how it would work on a street. And basically what you see here is the same plot of land. It's just that you turn the street into a giant catchment surface and then direct the flow into the public space. And then you do these similar things on private space to make the land permeable, as you're also catching it off of hard surfaces. And you turn parking lots into giant covered cisterns. You make that space available to community markets, and you end up having more than enough water to actually have recirculating daylit streams that restore some kind of natural ecological dynamism to the community. And then major institutions like universities, middle schools, high schools would put cisterns, like they're already doing in LA, under sports fields and turn the campus into a place of edible food production, which is inevitable and essential if we're actually going to become a resilient society. So that was the basis of the proposal, which was well received. Okay, now I'm going to end the presentation by running through a bunch of slides. I want to tell you, this piece is about showing you the incredible urban agriculture. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to ask where you did the curb cutting before you made guess where I'm going. Did you work with Brad Lakeman, or did you just read his book and decide this is a good idea?
Believe it or not, before Brad did that stuff, a 13-year-old young woman in Portland who had already gotten her community to do that, and then we told Brad about it when he bicycled all the way to Portland to present about his work in Arizona at the Village Building Convergence. So we're on the same page, and obviously he's like a superhero.
I should include her in his forward.
Yeah. Okay, I just want to show you the urban agriculture system. It's apparent that nobody knows what all is going on. It's like beyond control. So I wanted to give a presentation at the Eco Farm conference in Monterey a few years ago about this system. And so I went around interviewing all these different activists about what they knew was happening in the city. So I'm going to show you what's happening in Portland around food in terms of the city becoming a giant salad. So here we go. The salad bowl of Portland is the fact that we have this urban growth boundary that contains all the growth within a distinct boundary, outside of which we protect farm and forest land. And this is true of every city and town in Oregon. They all have a growth boundary to contain sprawl. So that's the great cradle. And what is beautiful about that is we're constantly reinvesting on the interior of the bowl. And when it grows as extensions of systems we've created that integrate everything through multimodal transit. And then growth is supposed to happen along the transit. Okay, so the perimeter of the bowl is depicted as red lentils, and there's a whole bunch of split peas and pumpkin seeds in here just to show you all of the backyard and front yard gardens that are already happening all over the freaking place. Okay, and then we have these big community groups growing food as whole cultures, whether it's eco-villages or co-housing communities all over the city. And so that takes the form of a few sprinkles of spinach leaves. And then you have community gardens happening in all sorts of circumstances, including public parks and schools and open lots and the rooftops of major institutions like these, which looks like some mushrooms here. And then you have co-ops happening all around the town and NGOs doing culturally specific projects and orchards being installed around the city looking like a whole bunch more edible greens kind of swirling there, and suddenly you have a circle of hazelnuts representing the Food Policy Council connected to the mayor and the city council. And then just all these spontaneous random expressions, like people towing their starts through the street to sell them at market, on bike trailers, food forests, on all these incidental spaces like here at Southeast 12th and Market. This one brings Japanese people across the Pacific Ocean to see this thing every year. And I put up about 19 of them in my house at least once a year because they're here to see these kinds of installations that they want to be inspired by to bring back to Japan. Trees off the side of freaking buildings? What's next? Okay, here's Henry Soto. He came to Portland to help out. He's organizing all this seed saving and then a big part of the CSA infrastructure happening in the city. So even more stuff happening. Seed saving, seed swapping culture, all these different events of people just geeking out on seed swapping. Farmers markets, like 50 of them across the city every week now. See a bunch of loquats swirling in there now. And then all the farmers get a hold of this warehouse where they partner and share stories and all these strategies and do all organizing. It's called the Red. So that's represented by a big red apple. And then doctors are actually growing food outside of their offices, getting their patients involved in growing food and then preparing food as part of a whole sort of life course of healing. Subsidized housing, replacing arbitrary decorative landscaping with edible, native beneficial landscapes that is installed and tended by the people who live there as a way of engaging youth and so many other great outcomes. Pollinator corridors being installed along residential right-of-ways, so just like flowers, flowers, flowers knitting the neighborhood together. This is this huge project happening in Southeast Portland that's installing food forests on 7 contiguous pieces of land. A native camas field restoration inspector comes to Portland and coaches the settler culture in installing camas along the sides of streets so that, you know, we're doing something to try to restore the camas fields that settler culture intentionally destroyed at the onset of camas. Camas is probably like, there's 2 really key tubers that Native people of the Northwest depended upon for the longest time and still cultivate, and that's wapato and camas. And camas is this beautiful lavender-colored, periwinkle-colored flower that the native insects of the region love the most, like depend upon the most. And those fields have been devastated. But what's really lovely is you put them in and they replicate madly, and then you kind of harvest all of them and you take at least 2/3 away to eat and you put 1/3 back, and then they just keep expanding like that. This is our friend Judy Bluehorse, who's one of the advisors of City Repair, and she's been guiding the installation of edible native plant gardens in public parks around the region. And for some reason that was difficult for a while. Like people were like, oh no, if someone eats a berry, something could happen. So here's the freaking salad of the city. And I've just touched on a few of the things. There's so much more I didn't include in the presentation. But it's a beautiful thing to be part of a culture where nobody knows anymore all of the wonderful things that are happening. And I think that that's a dream we can aspire to. And even if you create a nonprofit, which tends to be, you know, any number of nonprofits that may be created by a community, they tend to become a little bit rigid. They tend to destroy themselves. Please let it get out of control. Encourage it to be more than you can track. Decentralize the power and the organizing so that it's as resilient as possible. That's it. Thanks.
Do you have Cash App or Zelle?
Say again?
Do you have Cash App or Zelle?
Or
Zelle or Cash App? What is your Cash App?
I'm not even Else in the organization would say, yeah, but I don't even know. So
Stephen, could you help?
cash and checks.
Hey, Julie, or yeah, because I see that you have donations there, and I would love to donate, but
Right. I think Stephen might have those.
If you went on to PayPal,
oh, you have PayPal? Yeah.
I personally do, so that if you put that toward me, then I would give it to the organization.
Okay.
So that's,
Just use your name.
yeah,
Okay, awesome.
yeah. Thank you. That's great. I hope that you're a billionaire.
In the making. All right. I received that.
Money helps sometimes. Somebody asked the other day, like, well, I mean, how do you handle money? What about money? And really, like when you're working, when a community is trying to kind of get itself going, if it waits for funding and whether or not it does anything is dependent on a funding source, that's a bad model. So we've always tried to make it so that the models are propelled by people sharing the resources that they have. And I know that's far more easy for some communities than others, but at the same time, $5, $20, sometimes you can, decide what you can do based on what has come forth. My favorite way to do it is everybody just gets so excited about what they've envisioned and drawn that they can't help themselves, and they give what it takes. And I think that most things that people want to start with, the scale they want to start with, is usually attainable by almost any community.
Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome. If anyone wants to get one of those books, I'll go get them from the truck. And they're 25 each. And yeah, cash or checks great, or the PayPal thing. But I think there's 5 of them.
What's the name of the book?
It's the place pair. Okay. Okay. Who wants one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. It looks like 6. I don't know. We'll see how many is in the car. I think there's 5.
I don't know about that. I do it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I kind of got some stuff in my pants earlier, and I had a sweater on me.
You should be able to hear that. If you tuned in, thank you for watching. That was Mark Lakeman here at the Shimmering Void in Bakersfield, California. And it was an excellent presentation, so if you missed it, go back and watch it from the beginning. And